This happened a long time ago, and thinking about it still creeps me out. I live in Adair County, Kentucky, on a horse farm, and one day in summer, about 5 to 6 years ago, my mother, who's the horse enthusiast in our family, found a horse that she wanted for sale in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. We'll call the seller of this horse James. For those of you who don't know, Lawrenceburg is one of several places in Kentucky who have claimed to see Kentucky's version of Bigfoot, and they call it the hillbilly beast, which has been spotted all over Kentucky. Me and my little brother, being suckers for those kinds of things, like most kids, went with her hoping to see it. Fast forward. James' house was far from town and on a one-way dirt road miles from anywhere. Only a few houses were dotted here and there on the side of the road, but this one I will seriously never forget. We were about 5 minutes away from the person's house we were getting the horse from, and going quite slow because we had a trailer hooked to the back of our truck. I'm staring out the window, hoping to see the hillbilly beast somewhere in the woods, along the side of the road, when I saw this house. This house had well over 20 mannequins throughout their yard, all shapes and sizes. Most were laying down or propped against what looked like a shed, but there were two that really freaked me out. One was an adult female tied to a tree next to the road, so close I could probably touch it if I rolled down the window and stuck my hand out. The second was the size of a baby. This one was nailed to a tree only a couple of yards away. Both of them looked really old and worn out, moldy, rotting, etc. My mom stopped the car and we were all just sitting there staring at this place. The house was old and run down, but obviously being lived in. But the shed next to it looked almost brand new, minus what looked like satanic graffiti written all over it. So being freaked out, we drove away. Fast forward again. Once we got to James, we asked him about the freaky mannequin place. He said he never saw anything like it. He also said he was in town just that morning and took that exact road, so it's likely he would have seen it. Once we left his house, we took a different way home so we didn't see this mannequin house again. Part of me says this could have been some freaky prank, but the other part of me is wondering, what if they weren't mannequins? I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just saying, my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, and my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I had a phone. The story begins when a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. I could never train her to do anything, but I fed her and she was sweet, if not the brightest dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. It's hard to describe, but I feel like someone was watching me. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking in my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks half a mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily. Footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. At night, it was out there, around the cabin. Here's the funny thing, I was never afraid. I never felt threatened. Not at all. At least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. And the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and I, we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods. Traces of fires and old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in. Garbage, food and drink, paper. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch, screened with a light door, and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard, with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, and a rabbit, and even a weasel one day. Like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them. This went on almost daily for several weeks. But one night, very late, I was awoken by some sounds. I lay in bed and I heard something from the porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog, who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door, in a perfect point position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on my porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It was not funny. The two final gifts were legs from either horses or cows, big and bloody. One was skinned. I mean, holy shit. The second to the last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods, howling on a trail, following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland suburbs of DC, got an apartment with a friend, and got a job and moved on with my life. One day not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It described a tall, yeti-like creature, fur covered on two legs, that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what happened to me. Following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick. Back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way. Country folks. I think the monster was an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now. Probably off his meds, but somehow functional and lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do. He would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed I was leaving. I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I do not think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets, and they took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill die. Okay, so around 9 or 10 years ago, I was living with my mom, my dad and older sister, in an oldish house in a very small village. When I say small, I mean its only main feature was a small church and a few scattered houses occupied mostly by old people. At the time it was the summer, so I wasn't at school or anything, and since we were so far in the middle of nowhere, I spent most of that time at home, glued to one screen or another. The usual routine was I'd wake up at around 10 or 11. By this point, my mom, dad, and sister had all left for work, so I had the house to myself. I'd go downstairs, make some toast, watch some random stuff on TV for an hour, before heading back to my room to continue with whatever game I was grinding through that particular day. The habits of a usual 17-year-old guy, cut off from the world by many, many fields. I should give a quick rundown of our house. It was an older cottage with 2 rooms upstairs, mine and my sister's, and everything else is downstairs. As you walk up the stairs, you got to a very small landing and could either go left to my room or immediate right, my sister's room. Basically, the way this was laid out was that I could sit in my room with the door open, and my sister's room is directly opposite. I should also mention that the ceilings in both of our bedrooms were slanted. We were basically in a large attic where the roof slanted down. Because of where the slant met the wall, we had a crawl space that ran the length of the house on either side of the rooms, both with a small door to access them. These were mostly used for storing normal attic stuff like Christmas decorations or old forgotten toys. The doors to these were thin little things, about 4 feet tall, with a small handle on the outside. This is very important because turning these tiny doorknobs opened them, but only from the outside. If the door was pushed shut with you inside, there was no way back out. I discovered this myself on more than one occasion. The door on my side ran along my room and along one wall in my sister's room, and hers ran along the other side, along my room. The space was not very big. You had to crouch or stand in it, and most of the time you were in there, you were crawling on hands and knees. Anyway, this one morning, I'm awoken to a familiar noise. Some sort of small creature rustling around in the crawl space on my sister's side. I could hear this because my bed was against the wall that ran along it. Not an unusual noise. Living in the countryside, we had mice almost constantly. They pretty much owned the storage spaces, no matter how many traps were put down. I thought nothing of it, and I got up and went off to begin my morning ritual of toast and television. The first odd thing I noticed was while watching TV, I could hear movement upstairs. My mom's room was directly above the living room, so I assumed she'd just not gone to work that day for whatever reason, and I continued munching. Around an hour or two later, I went back upstairs and booted my PC. As I was waiting, I turned around to my open door and faced my sister's closed one, and realized it was late in the day, and she had yet to leave her room. An odd thing, since she normally parked up on the sofa in the living room on her days off, and didn't move until our parents returned. We are not the most active family. I started to think that maybe she was at work, and I'd imagine the noise from upstairs. But as I mused this, I noticed the crack of light at the bottom of her door, as a shadow passed by it. Okay, so there's definitely someone in there, so it must be her. I once again pushed it from my mind and went back to my PC. More time passed, and the thought came back to me. Why would she be at home but not leave? She only has a small TV in her room and no books, so what had she been doing in there all day? I glanced back around and again saw a shadow under the door. She was still moving around in there, so what was up? I finally decided to go knock on her door. I knocked a few times and said her name. No answer. Weird, but maybe she had headphones on or something. I knocked a bit harder again and said her name again but louder. No answer again. Alright, I thought. Screw this, I'm just going to go in, so I cracked the door open and peered around. I found an empty room. Nobody inside at all. Slightly confused, but feeling better that it was just my imagination, I stepped in properly and looked around, and saw something that made me full-on panic. Near the bottom of her little door leading to the crawl space, there was a small hole that the mice had made to get in and out of the bottom. Really small, but just big enough to fit half of your hand through. There, coming through that hole, were 4 fingers, holding the door shut from the inside. At first I thought, no, it can't be fingers, don't be stupid, until I watched them slowly creep back through the hole, into the crawl space. I lost my shit. Very quietly though, I might add. I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me, and ran to my room. Being the stupid teenager I was, I grabbed what might be the most imposing weapon I could find. The fake Winchester rifle cap gun I got from Disneyland a few years previous. I figured that if whoever was hiding in that bedroom didn't believe it was a real firearm, I could at least hit them with it. I ran off downstairs to where my dogs were on the far side of the house, and I called my mom, who worked about a 5-minute drive from our house. She told me to stay put, and that her and her manager were on their way. And this time, I made a small upgrade, from fake plastic rifle to one of my dad's golf clubs. I felt much better with it. Finally, my mom and her boss, John, turn up, and I tell them everything leading up to this point. They say okay, and we all set off upstairs to investigate. Me, not very heroically, behind them with my golf club. We get to my sister's room, and I point to the door. I'll never know if my mom is just as hard as nails or massively stupid, but while John and I watch, she marches over to the door, yanks it open, and sticks her head in. A moment passes while she looks left and right, and John and I are preparing to yank her back from the clutches of the psycho, hobo murderer hiding in there before she shouts, "Chris, what the fuck are you doing in there? Get out." A small amount of backstory. Chris was my sister's boyfriend. Unbeknownst to me, the night before my dad had asked Chris to leave, as he stayed with us for about 5 days at this point. He said, "Yep, that's cool," and as far as mom and dad knew, he'd headed home. What really happened was instead of him leaving, him and my sister had planned to make it seem like he left, then he could stay another night. He would then wake up before my mom shouted my sister up for work, like she did every morning, and would hide in the crawl space and sleep in there until everyone had left for the day. The one small hitch in the plan that they did not think of was, you guessed it, me. They had forgotten I was home and conveniently sat directly opposite the only exit for most of the day, so he was trapped. When I knocked, he hid himself behind the door and held it shut to prevent being locked in. Anyway, my mom swiftly told him to get the hell out and to not come back. Sadly, this was not the last time we saw the guy, as it turned out he'd stolen quite a bit of money from my sister's room while he'd been hiding out, and then, because my sister makes terrible decisions, got her pregnant and proceeded to smash windows, trying to get at her and the baby around a year later. For a while, we lived in the same city when I went to uni, and he was spending time at the prison there for stabbing someone in a completely different town. Super great guy. Oh, and a small topper to all of this. As I mentioned earlier, the only rooms upstairs are mine and my sister's bedrooms. He'd been in there for close to 14 hours with no access to a toilet. But no worry for this guy, because he had a lot of empty bottles to piss in, which he kindly left behind for us to clean up. And finally, around a year later, my mom was getting the Christmas decorations out, which were at the far back of the storage space. She found a small bag filled with feces. I should mention where she found it is exactly next to where my bed is on the other side of the wall. That rustling that woke me up that day, it was him, hiding his shit amongst our tinsel and tree. I could give you a million times as a kid and young adult, I felt scared or paranoid playing in the woods. It's a beautiful place, and I spent my entire childhood getting lost. Not literally, out there by myself or with friends. As kids, we never got too far out there, but you could actually see the progression of us venturing further and further out as we got older, because of forts and carvings we would leave. This one particular time, like 1,000 times before, my friend and I had just graduated high school. It was our last summer of freedom, and we spent the entire summer camping and hiking out there. We had decided to try and find a new place to set up camp, and walked for what felt like a few miles before we came to a nice clearing. The area was relatively new to both of us. We got the camp set up and fire going, and the plan was to wait until nightfall, smoke some weed maybe, and play Monopoly. For sake of the backstory, on my friend and I, my buddy is a smaller, real goofy guy, but comes from a family of foresters, and always had a deep understanding of all the trees and different plants he came across. He had no fear of going out camping by himself. If I spent 10,000 hours in the woods, he's probably spent 50,000. As for me, I'm a taller, sturdier guy, and as we got older, I spent more time worried about women and sports, and the woods became a place for small parties. Also, I never had the balls to camp out alone. In fact, older me wouldn't go far at all when I was alone, because I could never shake the feeling of being watched, which was probably just paranoia, but still not a good feeling. Anyways, the camp is set and the fire is going, but it's getting lower and needs some wood. The sun is down and we're both cutting up having a good time. My friend is sitting on this little chair he always brought and loading up this makeshift bong. And I was crouched, breaking some excess limbs off of some of the logs that we had gathered for the fire. All of a sudden, this strong breeze cuts through the clearing. I couldn't tell you if it was the suddenness of it or what, but my friend and I both stopped immediately and looked at each other. The breeze went through just long enough to flicker our fire down to a small flame. We both sat completely still in almost total darkness. Neither of us said a word. Across from us on the other side of the fire, we could hear footsteps. They sounded like somebody was running and would slow to a walk and then run again. Definitely on two legs. By the sound of it, they were pacing back and forth over the same spot. Then, just like it started, it stopped with a softer crunch on the underbrush. I knew by the sound it had taken a crouch. I was crouched still, and knew I was staring right at it in the dark. My friend grabbed my shoulder and said, "Buddy." And when he did, I felt this surge of fear come over me. I could feel it and hear it in him. I had been so fixed on the footsteps and rationalizing what I heard that I hadn't even considered being afraid. But this was true fear. It was raw and made me feel helpless. I could hear my friend after a while grab some leaves, and he dropped them on the fire. For the split second that the leaves covered the fire, we were in complete darkness. Then the fire sprang to life. We both quickly grabbed more leaves and brush and threw it on the fire. I got some sticks and logs on there, and neither of us took our eyes off of the spot, or moved much for over an hour. Finally, the leaves crunched, and it slowly walked off. Whatever it was had sat crouched watching us, without moving, for far longer than any animal would. It wasn't until the footsteps disappeared that I realized the smell had disappeared as well. It smelled like a paper mill, spoiled eggs almost. For the rest of the night, Besides whispered remarks, neither of us really moved or stopped looking at the spot. Nobody went into the tent, and I had a very short light sleep, sitting on the ground with my head rested on my hands. My friend never went to sleep. In the morning, we packed up and silently walked back home. To this day, we talk about it. In the 7 to 8 years since it happened, my forester friend has not camped by himself out there since. To set the tone, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college, and I quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of not decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently, and there were shootings in broad daylight. Robberies, you name it. Well, for the first 3 years, I lived with roommates on a side of town that wasn't awful, but it was sketchy. So when I was making decent enough money, I moved out on my own. The house was tiny, maybe 500 square feet, if that. Super old and poorly built. It was just me living there, so I didn't mind how small it was. But what originally sold me was that it was in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and some wooded areas, with only a few houses nearby. Considering I hated being in the town, due to the continuous paranoia of getting mugged or shot, I loved the idea of living out there. So at the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. But a month goes by and everything is still swell to me, and I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place and spent long amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. Roughly 2 months into living there, I started to notice things out of place. Something for me to note is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as a storage space until he got moved himself. So he had a key but was never there. He kind of just popped in once every other week to grab something, and he would usually let me know beforehand. But I would come home to find my kitchen chair being pulled away from my table, or a bowl in the sink, things like that. They were very small things. I wrote it off as my roommate swinging by or just stuff I was forgetting. But then my dog developed this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He would just lay on the couch and chew his toys. He never barked, never did anything weird. But all of a sudden, he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He would literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and wouldn't stop until I came back in the house. He didn't want me to leave him there alone at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him, so I decided one day that I'd put a movie in while I was out, thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task up at work, and I knew I'd be home early, so I put in a copy of Hamlet. I know that's a boring movie, but I chose it because the copy I have is about 5 hours long. So I knew it would be playing when I came back. Fast forward 3 hours, long before Hamlet should have been over. I walked in the door. Not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and the Xbox were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over, and he wasn't even in town. I explained the TV situation to him, and he shrugged it off as a TV powering off when it idles for a while. Even though this is true, there are several reasons I know this isn't the case. For one, it wasn't idling. A 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. 2, even if it had shut off, my Xbox wouldn't have. I have left it on by accident for weeks, while I was out of town or whatever, and it was still on when I came home. Always. But it was completely powered down this time. The weird thing is, none of my stuff was missing and the door was locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself that it was something weird with the Xbox or whatever, and I shrugged it off. That is until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she even walked by the house while he was out, he'd start yelping and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me and made me incredibly cautious of her. I put some cheap alarms on my doors, the kind that go off when the door is open, and I slept with my pistol handy. The second night, the alarms were on my doors. I was woken up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of my bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. But once I got to the door, it was shut, and there was nobody there. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room. The door would have had to open for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and landed there. Something else weird, the door was locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my lock after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police wouldn't do much as I had no witnesses and no leads, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the locks. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that. But I later found out that the close neighbor that my dog hated had previously lived in the house I was renting, and the locks had never been changed. I have no way to prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. Why though, I can't figure out. Nothing of mine ever went missing. The most unsettling part for me though is that she had tried to come in at night until the alarm scared her off. How many times had she been in my house at night while I was asleep, and why?